All right, so if everyone could mute herself, except for Julia, and Julia, hold on a second, I
Shep,
will.
Shep, you need to mute yourself. Thank you.
Julia
Good
has,
morning, everyone. I can say a word while you're pulling it up.
say a word. Yes.
Okay, good morning. And I thought, let's do a little musical theater. Folks have mentioned what a piece of work is Man from Hair. So speaking of, sex, drugs, rock and roll, we're going to go right into it. This song, as I learned, because I was familiar with some of the bigger, more notable, famous songs from Hair, but I hadn't been of this, so I just learned it. And apparently the context is the main character, Claude, has just embarked on a marijuana-fueled hallucination journey. And the cast is playing children's games that slowly evolve to become simulated war games that get more and more intense. And by the time this song is sung, there are just a couple of people left standing amidst a sea of bodies.
All right, I have it up. Hold on a second. And hold on. Oops. Yes.
And I'm gonna have the track in my ear because.
All right, we are ready to.
Yeah. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth. This goodly frame, the earth seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you. This brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof, fretted with golden fire. Why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason.
Beautiful, Julia. Thank you so much for that. So
that was so fun.
That was really great. So we go from Hamlet to Hair, also, of course, starting with Psalm 8. And it's really inspired a lot of different things. So that's beautiful. And what a wonderful way to learn it for this. And maybe tomorrow, Yael will sing it in Hebrew for us.
Oh, we have something else up for tomorrow. We're all, so.
I did post, let me just say a minute. I did post in the Facebook, our Facebook group, that Hair was done in Hebrew, as Yael knows from her childhood. And Israel has done a lot of the classic musicals in Hebrew, including my favorite, though, is My Fair Lady with The Rain in Spain, coming up with Hebrew words to rhyme in that way, which we'll save that for another day. But I'm thrilled that Jacob Nimi, our cantor in Madison, Wisconsin, is going to give us a talk that will take up our whole session, except for the very end when we'll talk about the summer plans. Ending Psalm 8 before we begin Psalm 9, we're taking 2 sessions today and tomorrow to dive deeply with the fantastic expertise of this really spectacular class. Cantor Nimi will be teaching us today for the full class. And then tomorrow, Lisa Brown is going to be teaching us a lecture about musical instruments of the Bible. So these 2 sessions in between Psalm 8 and 9 will really enrich us. And we're thrilled to have this level of knowledge in our community of this learning, inside of our learning community. So Cantor Nimi, we're thrilled to have you take the class today.
I am so excited to talk to you all about this. We're currently working on getting me able to share my screen. So in the meantime, I'll just raise the question.
Bruce, you do that. Go ahead, Cantor.
Great. So I'll just raise the question that's come up a number of times.
Cantor, I'm sorry, you are ready to screen share.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bruce. So I'll bring it up in just a moment. But to raise the question,
just for folks who have questions, please put them in the chat while Cantor Nemi is speaking. And so he'll be able to continue with his lecture. And then at the end of the lecture, he'll look at the questions and answer them then, okay?
We hope to have about 10 minutes at the end for back and forth and Q&A.
Wonderful. So to raise the question that we have been kind of touching on again and again, which is, can we know what the recitation of the Psalms sounded like in ancient times? The shortest answer to that is, well, no. But if we reframe the question, what can we know about the recitation of Psalms in ancient times, we can start to get at some of the edges of the answer. And so I'm going to be approaching one of the edges of the answer to that question today by looking in particular at the accents marks that we've talked about it a little bit with the Psalms, and also some records that we have of ancient, medieval, and extant practices of chanting the Psalms. So without further ado, let's open up the presentation and go into presentation mode. Oh, and I did not share with audio. Hold on one moment. I need to do that because there's going to be some audio clips as well. Let me make sure that I do that. There we go. Share computer sound as well. Much better. Thank you for your patience. All right. And let's see here. Okay. So, in order to start talking about the recitation of the Psalms, we need to talk about a term, cantillation, which in its most simplest definition is the art of chanting biblical text in the context of a synagogue service. So that's anytime you go to a synagogue and there's recitation of scripture, like reading the Torah on Shabbat and reading from the prophets, or on certain holidays and festivals where we read from particular other books in the Hebrew Bible, like Esther and Lamentations, that there's an art of declaiming that text using a free rhythm and notated with a system of symbols that we call te'amim, accent marks. We've referred to these accent marks a number of times in this class. They are throughout the Hebrew Bible. They indicate musical motifs for many of the books in that public recitation, in that cantillation, but they also indicate proper pronunciation, that is where the accent is in the word, and also syntactic structure like phrasing and, for lack of a better word, punctuation. So as I said, these accent marks are in all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, but are applied differently in the books of Proverbs, Psalms, and Job, which are also, those three books are sometimes referred to as the poetic books, while the other 21 books are referred to as the prose books. In making this distinction, particularly making the distinction that these three books have a separate system of accent marks, and no one is really certain why. So our system of accent marks as we have in the Hebrew Bible today comes from we've called it the Masoretic school, which was a school of scholarship in Tiberias, circa 6th to 9th century CE. There was another notation system of accents that preceded it in Babylonia, or what we call the Babylonian school, which was centered in Baghdad, that apply the accent marks, or their accent marks, the same across all 24 books, making no distinction. But at the end of the day, the Tiberian school ruled out, and that is the system that we have today. So, if we're talking about these three functions of accent marks, these accent marks which are the actual emphasis within a word, the melodic material, and the syntactic structure, basically functioning as punctuation, I want to focus in on that last function, that function of being kind of like pseudo-punctuation. So take a look at this unpunctuated sentence. Let's try that again. Think punctuation isn't worth learning. Think again, because without punctuation, English is very difficult to comprehend. So just to make the point that if we're talking about the importance of punctuation in understanding what we're reading and what we're reciting and how it's structured, let's look at a sentence with and without a comma. Let's eat Bob. Let's eat Bob. The comma makes an incredible difference in our understanding of the meaning of this sentence. For another humorous example, look at these two signs and decide which would make you be more cautious, as opposed to perhaps fascinated. Caution, man eating crocodiles. Caution, man eating crocodiles. Oh, what the difference a hyphen can make. So we'll see that the trope marks can make a similar impact in our understanding of reading a sentence in the Hebrew Bible, regardless of whether we're looking at a prose book or a poetic book, across the board. So let's take a look at an example from one of the prose books. So this is from Exodus chapter 17, verse 9. This is my translation of this verse. And so I translated this, and Moses said to Joshua, "Choose men for us and go out to do battle with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand at the head of the valley, and the staff of God will be in my hand." So I was very specific about my punctuation in my translation, really trying to make it reflect the accent marks. If you'll notice, those of you who are familiar with the accent marks, who maybe chant Torah, will note that on the word Amalek, there is a accent mark called etnachta or atnach that is in the prose books the primary pause in the sentence. So in the accent marks of, if you're going to understand any level of distinction in accent marks in the Hebrew Bible, the best thing would be to understand the distinction between conjunctive accents and disjunctive accents. In their simplest form, conjunctive accents are indicating words that are connected in meaning to the next word, and disjunctive accents are indicating words that are separated in meaning from the next word. Conjunctive accents continue the phrase, disjunctive accents end the phrase. So, and just like we have in punctuation in English, there are different degrees of disjunctiveness. So like a period indicates more of a pause than a semicolon, which indicates more of a pause than a comma. Similarly, in the accent marks, you have etnach, the end of the sentence, which I'm going to circle here with my mouse because I forgot to put a box around it, is the highest degree of pause because it's the end of the sentence or the end of the verse. But the etnachta is the second highest level of disjunction. It's the big pause in the middle of the verse in prose books. So that is why in my translation, I put a period after the word Amalek. With me so far? Great. So in this sentence, I would also just note that you have other minor disjunctive accents that indicate lower degrees of pause. And for me, in my translation, I indicated those often with commas. So I did actually follow those. If we wanted to get into the weeds with the other trope symbols, we could, but I'm not going to get into the weeds with that. I would rather take a look at an example from one of the poetic books. And why not from one of the Psalms that we've actually already studied together, from Psalm 5. So this is my translation, adapted from New JPS translation of Psalm 5, verse 11. "Condemn them, O God, let them fall by their counsels. For their many sins cast them out, for they have rebelled against you." So in the poetic books, there actually is a disjunctive accent mark that trumps the etnachta. Forgive the phrase. And And it is, I'm going to circle it with my mouse here. It's the combination of this little caret over this one letter and the little comma underneath this letter. It's called oleviored. It might look like two separate accent marks, but it's actually one accent mark, and it is of a higher order of being disjunctive in the poetic books than etnachta. As you'll see here, it's the main pause. So I translated it with a period after by their counsels. Whereas when you have a longer second half of a sentence in the poetic books, that is oftentimes split with a etnachta, which I indicated with a comma. So we're getting the idea that the accent marks give us the same kind of structural information that punctuation might give us in English, which is really the main point of what I wanted to offer you. So, can that level of understanding of the structure be prescriptive for recitation of a psalm? We're going to listen to an example of a Syrian Jew reciting Psalm 1, and we'll hear that there definitely is a consciousness of the structure that's being provided by the accent marks. We're going to have a conversation about whether or not we can get any information about the melodic content, but for right now, I just want you to hear him using the structural content of the accent marks.
פרק א', the first chapter. אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים ובדרך חטאים לא עמד ובמושב לצים לא ישב כי אם בתורת אדוני חפצו ובתורתו יהגה יומם ולילה והיה כעץ שתול על פלגי מים אשר פריו ייתן בעתו ועליהו לא ייבול וכל אשר יעשה יצליח.
So I just wanted to let him get to the end of the verse. If you were reading the trope marks, if you were conversant in them, I can tell you, I can assure you that he is pausing on the disjunctive trope and he's continuing phrases on the conjunctive trope. And he's doing a major pause. Oh, sorry, my bad. I accidentally. So he's doing a major pause on that trope mark that I mentioned that is the major pause in the verses of the poetic books.
Cantor, can I just ask you, could you go back one slide? And I think what you and I discussed last night was how these, the trope marks right here on Exodus give you, each trope mark has a melodic theme to it. And so if you're chanting it according to the trope mark.
Oh yes, I forgot to do that.
Right, no, if you could chant that Exodus 17:9 for us and show us how each of those marks has its own little melodic.
Sure. So we have melodic content for the recitation of the prose books, particularly for the Torah, the first 5 books, that the practice in America is following, I think, a Lithuanian tradition of chanting the scripture. So and there's a couple of different versions. Conservative Jews chant slightly differently from Reform Jews, but they're all kind of based on a similar system. So if I was to use that melodic system, it would sound a little bit like this. Vayomer Moshe el Yehoshua bechar lanu anashim v'tzei hilachem ba'amalek machar anochi nitzav al rosh hagiv'ah umatei ha'elohim biyadi.
Thank you. So if you go to the next slide, this was a chanting done of Psalms, which the guy who chanted it really used a melody. He used 2 things. He used the punctuation, but he used them. If you were to use the signs here as melodic notation, that's what he did. It was a cantillation of the psalm, correct?
It sounds very much like he's using the trope symbols to indicate some kind of melodic content, because he does use the same melody for the major disjunctive accents every time. But As we'll see a little bit later, there's this critique of whether or not the same melody is being used for the conjunctive accents, and it gets very complicated.
Okay, I'll let you go on then to the next part, which
Absolutely.
Antonini, I just want to interrupt for a second to make sure everybody in the class understands the words conjunctive and disjunctive. For those of us who study language a lot, or I imagine music, those are very common terms. But we have a lot of people who don't necessarily study language or music, and those might be really new words. And I've used them a lot in class too. If anybody doesn't understand, please indicate in the chat and we'll come back to that at the end of the class, because those are very important concepts. And really, they're a little bit of buzzwords for those of us that are deep in the study of language or the study of music, but might not be known to everybody, and that's perfectly okay.
Right, and I think it's worth saying something now that clarifies it, because it's so critical, I think, to our understanding as we go forward. So if I was going to say the phrase, I want to say actually here that punctuation and accent marks in biblical texts are really meant to reflect the patterns of speech, to try to communicate the way that we speak that indicates meaning in our tone, the way we say something. So if I say, you ask me a question like, are you going to the store? And I say, I'm going to. You know that I'm finished with that because of context and because of the way that I inflected that sentence. But if I'm starting to say something and I say, I am going to, you know that I'm not finished. You know that it's continuing, that there's going to be another word in that phrase. And so what conjunctive accents are trying to indicate is a word that is connected in meaning to the next word of the phrase, whereas a disjunctive accent is trying to note a word that is ending that phrase.
Right. So Cantor, before you go on, the question you asked at first was, how did they sound? And we said, we don't know, but, and this is one of the buts, that might have sounded something like the recording we just heard, if indeed the cantillation marks in Psalms indicated melodic, some sort of melodic scheme, right?
Correct. And some musicologists have drawn upon extant traditions of chanting psalms in like Syrian and Yemenite Jewish communities as proof of a through line from historical practice going all the way back to biblical times.
Okay.
It gets very murky when you start trying to read these modern practices back on. What's better is to say, what can we learn from these extant practices?
Right. I'll let you go because I'm conscious of the time and how much fascinating material you have left.
All right. So if we're going to be talking about psalm recitation, we have to talk about what broad structure these accent marks provide us with. So biblical poetry, as I think we've talked about many times in this class now, is characterized by a style that's known as parallelism, which is consistently notable in the poetic books. That's Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, but is also common in the prose books as well. In parallelism, each verse is divided into two balanced halves. I might comment on the word balanced there, but this is from Jacobson's article on recitation of cantillation of the psalm, so I'll go with his quote. The second echoing the content and or structure of the first. One scholar that I rely upon also said that the second half sharpens the meaning of the first in some way, shape, or form. But there is some kind of echoing in either content or structure or both. So let's look at a really relatively well-known common example or paradigmatic example from Psalm 145. Anybody who goes to shul, goes to synagogue, and recites morning liturgy on a daily basis will have encountered this phrase from Psalm 145. Every day I will bless you. I will praise your name forever. So I color-coded the parallelism here. You see that the word every day, bechol yom, is paralleled by the phrase le'olam va'ed, forever. And the phrase I will bless you, avarcheka, is paralleled by I will praise your name, va'ahalala shimcha. So again, it's not exactly the same, but there is an echoing of some of the content. So, if we're going to be talking about the other school of thought about what extant practice of psalm recitation can give us evidence about ancient recitation of psalms, we have to talk about a practice called psalmody. So psalmody is a performance practice of psalms in churches and synagogues that is based on that parallel structure of the biblical poetry. In psalmody, the entire psalm is treated as what we would call a strophic composition, which means that a musical pattern, the same musical pattern, is applied to each verse. Each segment of the verse has its own unique melodic pattern, so that the first segment ends with a half cadence, which is a music term meaning an ending that feels unresolved, and the last segment ends with a full cadence, meaning it ends in a way that feels resolved. That is also depends on the culture that you're in. Some cultures, certain melodies feel resolved and some don't. So it depends on the host culture that we're talking about. All right. So here is an example of some Latin psalmody. This is 13th century Gregorian chant, a contemporary recording from 2013 of Latin psalmody for Psalm 114. For those of you who are familiar with Hebrew liturgy, with Jewish liturgy, you would recognize it as B'tzeit Yisrael Mimitzrayim. This is a little bit of a taste of Gregorian chant. So we get the idea. They're using a very clear parallel structure where the first half of the verse follows one particular melodic pattern and the second part of the verse follows another particular melodic pattern. Harold pointed out to me in our conversation yesterday that this use of an asterisk between the two segments of the verse is really common in psalters, in these collections of psalms that are meant to be sung in both Catholic and Latin, but also in Anglican collections of psalms meant to be chanted and declaimed in this way. So let's take a look at an example of some Hebrew psalmody, and we're going to note that there are some striking similarities. I want to just put out there that there is significant scholarship that suggests that the Latin psalmody in Gregorian chant was likely derived, at least in part, from contemporary Hebrew psalmody. And let that sink in for a moment and we'll hear what I mean in just a moment here. So here is an example of B'tzeit Yisrael Mimitzrayim from a Lithuanian Jewish community recorded by Eric Werner. B'tzeit Yisrael Mimitzrayim Beit Yaakov me'am loez. That sounded, in my ear, I don't know about yours, very, very similar to the Latin psalmody that we heard for this exact same text. Let's look at a different example. This is from Psalm 29 from an Eastern Sephardi community. Mizmor leDavid havu l'Adonai b'nei elim havu l'Adonai kavod va'oz. Again, it's pretty striking, the similarities in the melodic content, but even more than that, we see the exact same approach to the parallel structure of the verse. And for those of you who recognize accent marks from the Hebrew Bible, you'll note, oh, that Eric Werner decided to actually put the accent marks from the Hebrew text underneath and above his transliteration in his notation. And so you'll see that the et nachta is at the halfway point here. All right. So we need to go. So here is an example of psalmody that more of us on this call might be familiar with, especially, as I mentioned, those who attend Jewish worship on a regular basis, and particularly in the morning service, for Ashrei, which is actually, I would argue a little bit with Jeffrey Shayevitz, it's actually the beginning of Psalm 144 that then goes into Psalm 145, but let's not split hairs. Ashrei yoshvei veitecha, od yehalelucha selah. So Ashrei yoshvei veitecha is the first half. Od yehalelucha selah is the second half. Then I repeat that first half for the next verse. Ashrei ha'am shekachalo. And then the second half. Ashrei ha'am she'adonai Elohav. So actually, I want to backtrack for a moment because we encountered another verse from this exact same psalm when I was talking about parallelism. I'm going to go back here for a moment and say that if I was going to apply that exact same psalmody to this verse from the same psalm, I would chant it, B'chol yom avarcheka, va'ahalela shimcha le'olam va'ed. Exact same melodic pattern from that psalmody if I was applying it to another verse in the same psalm in the same context. All right, let's go back to where we were. So this is just to be a description of a practice of chanting psalms in churches and synagogues that we have records of, and I'll talk a little bit about how far back those records go of this particular practice of chanting psalms and why it might be a model for the way we think about recitation of psalms in ancient practice. So there is another subset of psalmody. I'm going to keep track of time. Great. Another subset of psalmody. I'm going to try to get through this relatively quickly if I can so we can have time for questions. That is called antiphony. And in antiphony, it's also derived from the parallelism in Psalms. And that performance practice, the leader will chant the first segment of the verse, and the choir or the congregation will respond with the second segment of the verse. So there's also another related form of antiphony that's described in rabbinic literature for the recitation of Hallel, and that's what I wanted to describe for you all right here. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud, which somebody can check me on my dates, but I think was codified circa 400 CE. And
yes,
so
it's from 200 to 500 CE, we say.
Thank you. And so in here we have a record of prescription for the recitation of a Hallel. Now I want to just really clarify that in our contemporary Jewish mind, the word Hallel has a specific meaning. Oftentimes people associate it with a recitation of a certain set of psalms on Jewish festivals and holidays, Psalms 113 through 118. But in the Talmudic rabbinic age, this era of that 2nd to 5th century, the rabbis of that time, when they said the word Hallel, they meant really any set of psalms. They could have been referring to any set of psalms that was being recited in ritual worship. So like, for instance, the psalms that we recite in the morning worship that we call Psukei de Zimra, verses of song, is also referred to as the daily Hallel. So a Hallel could be any set of psalms that's recited liturgically. So In their description here, an adult man reciting Hallel on behalf of the congregation would merely listen and recite after him the chapter heading of that Hallel. So when Moses says, Ashir al Adonai, I will sing unto the Lord, they would say, I will sing unto the Lord. And when he continued by saying, for he is highly exalted, they would just continue saying, I will sing unto the Lord. Conversely, when a minor boy is reciting a Hallel, the congregation would repeat after him everything that he says word for word. You might argue there might have been like a pedagogical reason for that. So we do have an extant practice of that first example of a man who's reciting a psalm phrase by phrase where the congregation is reciting the chapter heading after him in Yemenite psalmody. So this is a recording from the 90s of an extant Yemenite Jewish community at that time where they're reciting, I think this is Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Avdei Adonai. Somebody, is that?
That's what it was. Yes.
I'm trying to remember which psalm that is. If anyone wants to clarify on me that at any point, by all means. The notation here does not exactly match the recording, but I want you to hear this practice in action. So you're hearing that after every single phrase.
Psalm 113, by the way. Psalm 113.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That you're hearing that after every single phrase that the leader is chanting, the choir or congregation is chanting hallelujah after every single one, which is the first word that the leader chanted. So this is also, when we're talking about early records of recitation of psalms, it seems to be indicating something that's more akin to psalmody than something that is strictly defined by the use of the accent marks in the same way that we cantillate other books of the Bible. So you have a record from the Confessions of Augustine in the circa 4th to 5th century, who talks about the reader of the psalm uttering with a very slight inflection of voice that makes it nearer speaking than singing. You have a record from a 12th century account of Jews of Babylonia, modern-day Iraq, by the well-traveled Rabbi Petachia of Regensburg, Germany, who talks about them singing the psalms on the festival days with musical instruments, that they have particular melodies for the 10 melodies for the Asor psalms and 8 melodies for the Al Hashminit psalms. We also have record from the scrolls in Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where this is also an ancient copy of Psalm 145. However, it is punctuated by a refrain. Over and over again, they repeat the phrase, Baruch Adonai Baruch Shemo Leolam Va'ed, as a refrain after every single segment of every single verse, which would indicate that same kind of antiphonal practice that we were hearing in that Yemenite chanting. So, when it comes down to it, there are two schools of thought on what evidence gives us, what practices and evidence gives us the best idea of the edges of the answer to that question of what recitation of the Psalms might have sounded like in biblical times. There's the school of thought by musicologists from the early 20th century like Edelson that try to use the extant practices of the Syrian Jews to make the case that it is bound by the cantillation symbols, that there is some way in which the recitation in those communities proves that there is a lineage of tradition of recitation of the Psalms that is similar to our contemporary practices of chanting other kinds of scripture. However, the critique of that would suggest that our contemporary and extant practices of psalmody and also medieval examples of psalmody give us a much better clue as to what ancient psalm recitation might have sounded like. In the first place, Reinhard Flender, who's a renowned ethnomusicologist, suggests about the Yemenite and Eastern Sephardi Jewish recitation of the Psalms that they don't really conceive of the accent marks as an abstract paradigm. They're not learning the names of the accent marks for the Psalms apart from the biblical text. They're just learning how to chant the Psalms as a self-contained practice. And so it seems that they're really following more of a principle of psalmody by which those accent marks are structural indicators. So they are functioning like punctuation, but not actually giving defined musical content. So I fall down on the psalmody side of the debate, that psalmody practices give us a much better idea of what recitation of psalms in ancient times might have sounded like. So I'm going to return very briefly to our example from that 13th century Gregorian chant. B'tzeit Yisrael mi Mitzrayim, Beit Yaakov me'am lo ez. I'm not suggesting that the melodic content is the same. I'm not suggesting that we can get the notes of what they sang in the ancient temple in the land of Israel. What I am suggesting, though, is that the structural practice of psalmody is likely our best view of the edge of one of these questions.
Wow.
Wow.
All right. First of all, a little love to Cantor Nimi, and thank you for taking an extremely complex subject and making it easy for us, and making us hear Gregorian chant differently is possible and an echo of what we heard. And also that antiphony, the back and forth, because the Psalms that say with chorus, with leader, back and forth and back and forth. We have I
want to say something about the antiphony. Some of you remember, and I mentioned this sometime in our studying, for those of you who have been in any of my trips to Israel, one of the ideas is that the antiphonal recitation of the Psalms took place on those steps leading up from the city of David, on the steps going from the city of David up until the Temple Mount. And we call those the Psalms of Ascension. And they were, one idea is that we don't know the melody, but they were antiphonally back and forth. The Levites were the singers, theoretically, would stand and create a little bit of a gamut, but a good gamut that pilgrims would walk through as they ascended the steps to the Temple Mount. And those would be sung back and forth to each other. So fabulous. Let's see if there are any questions or comments. And please, hopefully people put, if you have anything in the
comments are how fabulous it was. Rabbi, given the time, do you have any questions for Cantor Nimi based on
what? So if you could go back to, I'm interested in the Syrian. Is the Syrian sound? Is that typical of other Arab music modes?
So there are different kinds of nusach, of cantorial modes in various Sephardi and Eastern Jewish communities. The Syrian tradition has been elevated by many in that region as like a very high art level of chazanut among various communities that are oftentimes lumped together as Eidot HaMizrach, the community of the East, which is really reductive, by the way. Setting that aside, the Syrian tradition is raised up as really a high art level of chazanut in that region. So when you find like pan-Sephardi or pan-Mizrahi communities, they oftentimes try to find a Syrian chazan because of that high level of chazanut.
Fascinating. I'd love us to study that sometime a little bit more also, all the differences of the different Arab culture-based things and the modes that I know Joyce has taught on, the difference with the Makam mode versus the Western.
I'll defer on that to somebody who knows more about, has more expertise in
Joyce
that area than
we'll
I
have
do.
to get Joyce one day to come and talk about
So
that.
Rabbi, I think that everyone is just absorbing this. We are fortunate enough to have Cantor Nimi with us all the time and have his email. So individual questions that anyone can come up with can just be sent to me and I will pass them along and maybe we will have a little follow-up discussion.
Absolutely, we'll continue this, and maybe what we'll do is after every couple of Psalms, Cantor Nimi, maybe you'll continue and do more presentations. Your thoughtfulness and also the clarity of the presentation, fantastic. And
for that, I want to thank Harold for reining me in because I had like 20 more slides that he.
Well, maybe we'll find. Listen, we're in the slow food mode of studying.
There's a graduate level version.
So we could come back and study more. This is not the. I want everybody to really enjoy this kind of level of studying, which means we can keep doing the deep dive. And think everybody, I want everybody in the class to think, would you have even been able to absorb an iota of what just happened 4 months ago? Think about kind of the curiosity we have now about the Psalms, that everybody is absorbing questions that we couldn't have even imagined having. So thank you, Cantor Nimi, for being part of this learning community and adding so much depth and so thoughtful and so deeply. And of course, I'm so impressed with those slides. I can't believe what you can do with those slides, but that I know I'm not supposed to be as impressed with. But the depth of knowledge behind the slides, the technology also impresses me. How fantastic to have you part of this class. I consider you a beloved colleague and wonderful to have you help expand our knowledge.
Really a pleasure, very much so. Thank you for the opportunity.
So we will do more. We will use you more in this way. Maybe after every couple of Psalms, we'll have more music. And tomorrow we have another session on musical instruments of the Bible that Lisa Brown is going to do a presentation on. And then on Wednesday, we'll start Psalm 9. Okay? Where are we time-wise? I want to be...
So Rabbi, we're at 10:47. Do you want to talk about...
So I think, is everybody
off?
okay to stay for a few more minutes and then that we can talk about the summer and then we'll sing out? Thank you. So we have a couple of options for the summer and I'm going to go over them and we're going to have a little bit of feedback and we won't make a final decision today, but this is to get everybody involved in this process. I've decided to take my full month off this summer. I think it's going to be healthy for me to kind of take a break from producing and interacting so that my mind and body and soul can rest and I can spend more time with my family, if it's at all possible. And so I'm going to be taking off the last week in July and the first 3 weeks in August. So here are the options for the Psalms class. Rabbi Rapport can teach the first week or two, depending on how much interest we have. And then we take a total break for the last 2 weeks or the last 3 weeks if people want to also feel like they're relieved from a regular study schedule. Or Rabbi Rapport can teach the first 1 week and first week or two. And then those who want to just read Psalms to move through more Psalms, Hebrew and English, and maybe have a light level discussion can continue doing that for the Psalms period of time. But there won't be a formal teaching. It'll be more reading Psalms and moving through them. Different people have different feelings about the need to move through and to complete. And other people are happier going very slowly as we come across them. Rabbi Rapport can do one of two things in teaching during the time she'll be teaching. One idea I had is to go back to a Psalm like Psalm 1, which we've already studied for kind of some of the deeper meanings, and to just study it for Hebrew grammar. To really dive deep into how to understand Psalm 1, which you now already have some exposure to, and to just take everything you're learning in all the different Hebrew classes this summer and just study it for Hebrew. Really dive deep into each word, understanding prefixes, suffixes, roots, and some of just language issues. That's one option. I'm laying it all out. Or she could continue like I'm doing the Psalms and also using Hebrew, which will, as people are interested, I can also start doing more Hebrew language as we're studying them. So one would be her going back to a psalm we've already studied and just studying Hebrew, which is very traditional Judaism. Jewish study is to keep going back to something you already know and deepening the layers of it. Or she could continue whatever psalm we're up to then and continue. Okay, so those are the range of options. Everybody get the different choices? So let's get a little feedback now.
Just to repeat, Rabbi, so I'm sure that everybody, so you're going to take 4 weeks off.
Right.
We have Rabbi report teaching either for 1 or 2 weeks, which means that there will either be 2 or 3 weeks where there is no clergy teaching the class.
Exactly.
Correct? When Rabbi report teaches her 1 or 2 weeks, she'll be taking a grammatical approach on the psalm, either going back to 1 or continuing with.
No. If she goes back to 1, she would do the grammatical approach. If she goes forward, she would do what we're doing now, which would include some grammar, but it can't be. And the idea is, and the teaching 1 or 2 weeks is up to the class. She's happy to do 2 weeks. The question is how much people want to break. So she can happily do 2 weeks.
And then once you are back, you will come back to teach us Psalms. Okay, we're not ending. This is just the 4 weeks. And for the 2 weeks that we're off, there's an option of being completely off or ourselves reading through more of the Psalms at this time. Okay, so should we take a few hands? Should we let people sleep on this and come back tomorrow? Okay,
take a few hands now. No decision making now.
I need hands for questions or input.
Harold, it's Bruce. It's Bruce.
Wait,
Just so you know,
hands.
some people need to leave for the Hebrew class. So some people are leaving.
Okay,
Sorry.
It's 10:50. Okay. Class starts at 11. We're going to stop in 5 minutes.
So 2 things you can do. You can write in the chat, and we will save the chat, and we'll study it very carefully as we did with the green screen question. Or if you have a question that the rabbi can answer to clarify something, please raise your hand and the rabbi will clarify that. Okay, so write in chat your preferences or raise your hand and we will recognize you for asking a question. All right, and I may actually write this up and email it to everybody so it's clearer if that's okay. So we have, how about sending out a poll? Okay, we will be looking at the chat. In the last minute, does anyone have any questions for the rabbi that would clarify what she just explained? I don't see them. So why don't we leave a few minutes for chat so people can give us some opinions and go to their Hebrew classes, and then we will continue this conversation tomorrow.
Do the music out.
Okay. So the music
and then
out, all right.
So while we're doing music out, write in the chat and we'll get back to everybody. Thank you all, and thank you, Cantor Nimi.
Oh, Cantor Nimi, our star.
Cantor Nimi.
Thank
you,
Julia. That was amazing. That was fantastic, and I'm familiar with cantillation, but you took it to a whole nother level. So thank you. And I'm struck in terms of this soliloquy from Hamlet, the contrast between kind of the depths of destruction that humans are capable of and the heights of learning and erudition that we just experienced in this class. How, what a piece of work is man. It can be both ways. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, I have of late. But wherefore I know not lost all my mirth. This goodly frame, the earth seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you. This brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof, fretted with golden fire. Why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason.
Wow.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy studying Hebrew today for those of you who are in Hebrew class or Rabbi Cohen's class, whatever you're studying. And see everybody tomorrow at 9:45 or 10 o'clock.